if you look at when the faith is the strongest, you often find it was when the imagination was engaged. When you find faith is the weakest, you often see that imagination is neglected. And I would say we are in a time in which the imagination is neglected. And as a result of that, there's less faith.
What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Logos Podcast. This is Deacon Max.
This is Deacon Joseph.
And on today's episode, we may have the most special guest we've ever had.
It's very possible.
Right?
It's very possible.
And his name is Father Stephen Beseau, our rector, our boss, most immediately, as it were. And so he is, in fact, the most special guest we've had on, I would say. Would you agree?
I would agree. Father Beseau, how are you?
Well, I'm great, but I don't believe a word of what you just said.
As one Polish professor here said, you are buttering me up. That's exactly what we're doing right now.
We're very excited to have you on. We'll get a chance to hear a little bit more about who Father Beseau is here in a minute. But just before we get into this exciting episode on the imagination, which is... I always think of SpongeBob when I say that.
The
imagination. Do you know the reference from SpongeBob? There's a
no. Too old.
Too old.
Right.
Oh, come on.
Anyway. I know SpongeBob, but I don't think I've ever seen it.
We'll send it to you.
You're probably better
That's
for
great.
it for never having seen it. Yeah. Although I know some people who would argue with me on that.
Yes, it's true.
But welcome to Logos Podcast. We are glad that you're here. Thank you to all of our listeners and our subscribers, people who continue to support us and certainly pray for us. We are incredibly grateful for that.
That's right.
If it's your first time, Deacon Max and I are seminarians, transitional deacons, getting ready to be Catholic priests. And this podcast is about introducing you to the Logos, the Lord Jesus himself.
And if you're not new here, that still remains the case.
It's still true.
That's the case.
It's still true.
That's right.
You've heard us say that many times. But so thanks. Just a quick shout out to all of our patrons and supporters and subscribers. Thank you for your continued assistance with this project that allows us to interview and have great discussions with men like Father Stephen Beseau. So without further ado, let's figure out who this guy is. Father Beseau, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? Where are you from?
Yeah, I am a priest of the Archdiocese of Kansas City in Kansas.
Okay.
And I've been a priest. I'll be ordained 30 years on June 10th.
Wow.
So it's a big deal.
Year for you.
Yeah,
wow.
It is. And it's amazing how quickly it's gone, And in many ways, I still think I'm just a few years ahead of you guys. But then I realized, no, I'm not. Not only because of SpongeBob, but also your musical tastes and
you're a senior,
movie
that's for
taste.
Sure. Yeah.
So, but I grew up in Kansas. I'm from Kansas. I have a bumper sticker in my office. It's somebody framed. It says Kansan by birth, Jayhawk by the grace of God. And so I do take that to be a sign of God's providence and love for me.
You're part of a winning basketball team.
Except for this year.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's okay.
It's all right though.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No,
and the Chiefs, huh? Except for this year.
Let's not talk
about
that.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. All right. Okay.
Yeah. But no, I grew up in Kansas. I'm the oldest of 5 children. And I went to the University of Kansas. And I've had a lot of different assignments. I've been a pastor of a couple parishes. I was a chaplain of 2 high schools. My longest assignment as a priest was 10 years at the University of Kansas, where I was an alum. Then I came back as chaplain.
That had to be so cool.
It was great.
Yeah.
It was great. It felt a little bit like the inmates running the asylum, coming back, as I was a student at the center, and now I'm in charge of it. Right. So it was different. But although I came back as a priest and I was older, and so there was certainly a change there. But in fact, when I went there, I was 39, and which I thought, 39, it's not that old. But I remember it was probably the first few weeks there. A group of students and they took me out to see a movie, and one of the girls was talking. She was a freshman, and she was talking about some old dude. She was talking about this guy, and the way she described it, it didn't seem like he was super old. Mm-hmm. I said, by the way, how old is this really old dude? And she goes, I don't know. He's like 27. So at that point, it was great for me. It's like I realized I'm not going to try to be their friend, their buddy.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not. It's impossible at 39.
27 still hot take to be an old person, right?
I am very old and wise as a 27.
You are, yeah.
Yes, thank you, Father.
Well, for an 18-year-old.
Yes, for an 18-year-old.
Yeah.
That's why all the high schoolers think I'm so wise.
I know, yeah.
If only they knew. No.
So you served as a chaplain.
Yep. And then from there, and in that time, before that, I went to Rome. I got my doctorate, and then it was 10 years into my time at KU that I was asked to go to join the faculty at the Athenaeum in Ohio. So I taught moral theology.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Yeah, I taught moral theology there for 3 years. Great seminary, great group. It was actually then Father Earl Fernandez who hired me or brought me on. He was the academic dean. Wow. And I signed the contract, and then the next week he left to go to Washington, D.C. So I don't know if I had anything to do with that. But,
that is Father Earl Fernandez, who is now Bishop Earl Fernandez.
That's right.
Who has been on this podcast before and is my bishop. He's a great man, but he left you out to dry. He hung me out to dry. And then, 3 years later, I became the rector at the Pontifical College Josephinum.
Which has been a great blessing to us.
It's true.
And we came to Father Beseau when we initially launched this project, as it were, and he allowed us to continue and to do it, to start it. And we just celebrated what?
4 years.
4 years.
4 years of Logos
4 years.
podcast.
That's right. 4 years Logos podcast. And so we're listening to this. It would have been 4 years. So I just wanted to thank you, Father Beseau, for that. And so now, after he's begged us, we've decided, I guess we'll bring him on, out of justice, giving him his due as
a virtue of piety,
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if I could just tell those who are listening and watching, they're not lying. I did beg.
No.
I did beg.
No, he's been long overdue. We wanted to bring him on, and I think this is going to be an interesting topic. I was very intrigued by you proposing it to him, by you talking to us about what you think the imagination brings in the kind of intellectual process and the process of coming to know truth, and its relationships, as we're going to talk about, are probably more specifically in American culture, American Christianity. So, that's it.
Why do you think? Yeah. So let's just get right into it. Why do you think, Father, that the imagination is an important topic to talk about?
Yeah. So I think in the history of the church, if you look at some of the great movements, and I'm thinking of Saint Benedict. I'm thinking of Saint Ignatius of Loyola. Also, as well as like John Henry Newman, now Saint John Henry Newman, and Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict. They all utilize the imagination in terms of what they're doing, right? And so you see this throughout the history of the church. Also, too, and this is my own reflection, if you look at when the faith is the strongest, you often find it was when the imagination was engaged. When you find faith is the weakest, you often see that imagination is neglected. And I would say we are in a time in which the imagination is neglected. And as a result of that, there's less faith. But there's also other things too, and we might talk about that. I think why there's such fear and anxiety among young people. I think it's because the imagination has been neglected. Also, the memory. That's another aspect.
Which plays into imagination.
It does play into it, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. And so right now, I think we're in a time when the imagination is neglected. And as people who are passionate about proclaiming the love of Jesus Christ and proclaiming the gospel and going out to the world, looking at the imagination, it can be a real great benefit for what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Friends, sorry for cutting in the middle of this episode.
Are you really that sorry?
No, not really. Hey, guys, we're entering into a partnership with the Augustine Institute.
The Augustine Institute is awesome. You should definitely check them out. They are a graduate-level school of theology that offers awesome degrees in pastoral theology, Catholic education, biblical studies, and straight-up theology.
Straight up. Right, these courses can be taken on the campus,
That's
especially
right.
their new beautiful 300-acre campus. Are you kidding me?
Gorgeous campus along the Missouri River in St. Louis.
Or go online.
That's right.
Right? But, second case scenario.
That's right.
Right? Or hybrid.
Best of both worlds.
Boom, 50-50.
But seriously, the faculty and staff at this institution is imbued in the tradition of the Catholic Church. They offer confession and adoration and Mass as a part of their culture, and you will be immersed in the beauty of the Logos if you attend this university.
Scripture, the Catechism, Church Fathers. Come on. This is awesome. Hey, guys, and also check out the link below because their class registrations are still open, and you could apply for a scholarship. Who doesn't want free money?
Fall of 2025. Go check it out.
Thanks, guys. If I were to ask you, Father, just, if we're speaking here about what the imagination is, what would you? So we say this, and I agree with you. But somebody would ask, like, how would you define, or what would you say is the imagination as we're speaking about it now?
Right.
I think.
The interesting thing is that nobody really can define the imagination.
Except SpongeBob.
It's left up to the imagination.
Well, see, maybe I just haven't done the right research.
There's just one episode of SpongeBob. It's become a meme where he says imagination, and there's like a rainbow that appears, and then for some reason that's just like seared into my head. So.
Yeah, so that's the clearest definition that you.
That's the clearest definition I have. That's why we brought Father Beseau on to try to elucidate a little bit more.
Actually, that's the perfect definition. No. So imagination, it's either an act or it's a mental faculty. In which there's mental images that are formed of objects that are not seen, that are not present. So you can imagine the past, you imagine the future, right? Well, I'm not imagining you guys. I see you. You're right here. So there's no imagination. But I can imagine what's dinner tonight, or I can imagine what's my future in 10 years. I can imagine a horse. I can imagine a dog. There's no horses or dogs here. So that's what the imagination is. It's either an act or it's a faculty. So theologically, Aquinas says that it's a storehouse of images, right? He talks about this storehouse or treasury of forms that's received through the senses. And I don't want to get too much into theology early.
Please do.
Are you sure?
Yeah, this is actually really helpful.
So Aquinas wouldn't say that imagination is something of the mind, but it's something of the soul. And in terms of the hierarchy, everything's a hierarchy with Thomas, and in the church too, much of theology. It's not high on the hierarchy. We know according to the Thomistic anthropology or psychology, the high point is the intellect.
Yep.
And the intellect is the speculative and practical intellect. Then there's the will, which is the rational appetite. Then underneath that, you have the passions, right? You have the concupiscible appetite, the irascible appetite. And then underneath that even, you have the sense powers of sense knowledge and the external senses, so internal and external. Imagination, along with memory, according to Aquinas, is an internal sense power. So but it's not very high up.
It's low. It's almost lowest.
It's almost on the intuitive level.
The only thing lower, what he calls the vegetative or locomotive. Basically that, a vegetable has the same power.
Scratching myself or something. Something like that.
Or I can walk, the locomotive. So it's not that high up in the hierarchy, according to Thomas. Now I will make an argument, and I do make this argument, that I think Thomas undersells the imagination. Now I know all the Thomists are clicking off right now, but ultimately, the imagination, it's a faculty that we use to remember or recall things that were in the past or in the future that aren't present.
Yeah, and that's helpful. And it's funny that you mentioned Thomas maybe didn't give the imagination as much weight as it is due, because when I'm sitting here and thinking about it, even in just, you just laid out all these technical theological terms and anthropological terms, but really, as I've been thinking about this episode, I do seem to operate according to the assumption that imagination is kind of, it's like make-believe stuff. It's the fairy tale. It's further from truth than, for example, scientific knowledge or even theological, investigations.
The practical intellect.
I think of imagination as kind of something for like children, and they play and they make believe, and that's cute, but that's not reality, right? And so maybe that's because I'm formed by St. Thomas, but maybe it's because it's a big part of our cultural, the air that we breathe right now is thinking of the imagination in this way.
I think that's more important.
Okay.
I think, and not just our culture today. This is the modern epistemological assumption. This goes back centuries.
Okay.
Right? That somehow faith is unreasonable. The imagination is make-believe. It's all about make-believe. And therefore, rationality is only what can be perceived by the senses.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And so you're lumping the imagination in as a necessary component of faith even.
I'd say essential.
Okay.
Absolutely. Not the only aspect of faith.
Right.
But essential. And there, I'm just following Newman. And I think in a way Ratzinger, although I don't think he's ever really gone into much of that, but certainly Newman.
And it's interesting because you make this, we're talking about imagination as something looking to the future, looking to the past, but something that informs the present.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not like it's detached from our existing reality. In fact, it informs all that we do necessarily.
Yeah.
Right? We're probably have, ideas of what maybe our priesthood's going to be. That may or may not be the case, but we've built a storyline by which we're living. We have these impressions on our mind, on our soul, that is going to inform the way that we live and the way that we're living now.
Even now, yeah.
Right? So as to move in that direction, as it were.
So let me ask you this, Father. So imagination, you're saying, is essential for a life of faith. Help us understand that a little bit more. What does that mean? What does that look like?
A lot of times when we talk about faith, when people talk about, and more importantly, maybe a step back, it's not so much how we live faith, but how we're formed in faith.
Okay.
There's a number of things. When we talk about, we want to form people in faith. We want to form a young child. We want to form university students. We want to evangelize. We want to bring somebody to the faith. We don't bring people to the faith. We bring people to the faith, but we form them, we educate them, we engage them according to the aspects of their psychology, of their soul, right? So how have we traditionally formed people in the faith? Well, we can talk about forming the speculative intellect.
Which is,
So
what is that for
our
listeners?
So we talk about the intellect in using Thomistic terms. He talks about two aspects of the intellect. There's the speculative and practical. And so the speculative is the ideas of the mind that we would think about. The practical intellect is, so the speculative intellect is oriented to the truth.
Okay.
The practical intellect is oriented to the truth that in light of action, right? So speculative intellect is mathematical equations,
principles,
dogmas, anything like that we would talk about. So when we talk about
abstract, yeah.
So if we want to form somebody in the faith, we might say they enter into the OCIA, right? They want to become Catholic, so they go through this program, this courses. Well, a lot of it is speculative knowledge. Here's what the church said: the Trinity is one God in three persons. The Eucharist is this. This is this. And here's the history of the church. It's a lot of knowledge, right there. So that's one aspect of the faith.
Important knowledge,
super important.
Oh, absolutely. Exactly. That's why I say imagination is not. It's essential, but it's not sufficient.
Yeah.
Then you have practical intellect, and so this is about what do you do, and this can be as practical of how do you do a podcast, how do you build a cabinet, but also how do you do your work well, how do you love, how are you a good husband, how are you a good father, kind of thing.
I like the building a cabinet image. When I'm building a cabinet, I'm using my reason, I'm using my mind, but I'm not doing it in the same way that I am when I'm thinking about God or, sitting in my room reading philosophy. My mind is being used in action, right? In the activity of doing this thing.
And yet those principles do inform this cabinet making in a way,
implicitly,
right?
Absolutely.
Least, right? But then then we're talking about the imaginative intellect, right? Which is what we're talking about more so now, right?
Yeah. So my idea of the imaginative intellect is a bit out there.
Sure, that's
so
okay.
We
have a lot of
takes
out
from
there.
Father Steve Beseau. Here we go.
It is a hot take.
Yeah.
It is a hot take. If I had a hot take, I have a couple, but this is one in particular that I think actually is a hot take that works.
Yeah.
So my point is that I think we've downplayed the imagination, and we have not. What I argue is that the imagination is not just the sense power, right? It's something but it is actually an aspect of the intellect. That the imagination. The act of the imagination is an intellectual act, which is something that Thomas never said. Newman hinted at it. He never really went at this far. But I think if he lived maybe 10 more years, I think he would have gotten there.
And you think, I wonder if, this is again a theology again, but I'm thinking of Balthasar, Hans von Balthasar, right? People may not know their name, but one of the things he talks about a lot is this idea of the theodrama, right? It's deeply imaginative, and it's deeply impactful when people hear about it. Theodrama is something like we're living, right? God has prepared the stage for salvation to unfold, and we are particular characters in this play in which God is saving us. Okay, theologically, that makes some sense, but also imaginatively, we can place ourselves as characters in this story of salvation that is so appealing, right?
Yes.
But again, so he's one of those, I think, thinkers that maybe has this idea of the imaginative intellect.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And so your thesis, Father, is that so you said the imagination it's intellectual more than it is sensible, right? So for St. Thomas, it was, he thinks of man's highest capacities being reason and will, and then our lower capacities involve our sense functions, right? Our bodies. And he tied imagination to the senses, right? Because they're images that we get through our sensible interaction with the world.
Yes.
But you are proposing that we should think of the imagination not as necessarily a function of our sense faculties, but actually a part of the intellect itself, a part of reason itself.
Yeah, you articulated that very well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And why is that? Why do you think that?
Because I think it reflects reality. And it's a better description of the human person. So to stay with Thomas, Aquinas describes two things. So I'm going to talk about faith and conscience. Okay, so you think about faith. Thomas says faith is the act of faith is done through the speculative intellect, right? Because the speculative is just truth in itself, which is ultimately God, right? And then conscience is an act, it's a judgment of the practical intellect. But I would contend that those are both within what I would call the imaginative intellect. So what we want to think about is, imagine a triangle, right? So if you can imagine each of the intellects as a point on the triangle. When we come, and maybe we can think of a couple of examples. Let's stick with faith. How about the Eucharist, right? So how do we, when we believe in the Eucharist, what do we believe? And how do we believe it? Like all three of us here believe that Jesus is truly present in the most blessed sacrament, right? Well, it's a result of the speculative intellect. We've read John 6, we've studied Trent, we've looked to the catechism, our parents and our catechists have taught us things, right? So that would be the speculative intellect. We've learned the knowledge and we're able to reflect it in a test or say things. We also have the practical actions. We've been to Eucharistic adoration. We remember our first Holy Communion, right? Those are the kind of things that we've done.
We have a Bible or something like that. Little things to express.
Absolutely, yeah. But we practice the faith,
Correct.
right? And so the practical intellect is about doing these things. And we've done this. We receive Holy Communion. Maybe we've even had experiences of Christ's true presence. But what the imaginative intellect does is something very different. It takes that knowledge, it takes those experiences, and it creates in itself a reality that says not only is Jesus truly present in the Blessed Sacrament, but I believe Jesus is truly present in the Blessed Sacrament. And this is an authentic aspect of my life. And so and this is where it's not just a speculative, practical, and of course the will comes in. That might be a little bit too much, but at this level, it's a speculative reality, the knowledge. It's the practical practices, and it's also then this tying it all together. Now, I stole this from Alistair McIntyre, who I know you know well. Right. I don't know how much.
I've read a little bit of After Virtue, not all of it.
Well, it's in that book. He talks about that. When he describes virtue, this is where I got this from. He talks about tradition, narratives, and practices. That a virtue, it's the traditions, narratives extend the traditions, and the practices are lived out virtue, right? And that's where I kind of took this, and it really fits well that the speculative intellect is like the traditions, the practical intellect is the practices, and the narrative is the imaginative. And that's where faith and conscience comes in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And it's also, I'm thinking even, so, we use the Eucharist as an example, a profound example of this trifold movement. But I'm even thinking like more simply like a kid on a football team or a basketball team.
Amen.
Right? Like he operates under all three aspects of those realities. You Joe, played basketball yourself.
Yeah, you know the rules of the game, right? So speculatively, you kind of know what basketball is and what
you look to
the goal
you look to the Giants who
right. You practice it, right? So that's the practical intellect in action. But then you also, and this was certainly the case when I was young, you kind of see yourself as a part of this story in which you're engaging with this reality that is basketball. And that's what makes it meaningful for you. It's what motivates me.
And for Joey, part of that imaginative intellect included his desire to be a black man and play basketball as a black man, which is, I think, important for our listeners.
This is the first time this has been disclosed on live on our podcast.
That's right.
Wow.
So,
when I was in middle school, that is true.
But they're athletic people, man. I can see as a young basketball player how that would be. Yeah. It's natural. Well, my point being here, I mean, joking, we're saying that, but what you're saying carries over even into it's everything.
It's really the most important. I mean, when you're a young player, you start the season out in high school and you play college ball too. Yep. You didn't say, "Oh, what's your goal?" Well, my goal is to go, 12 of 14 from the field and shoot, 78% from behind the 3-point. No, you say like, I want to win a championship.
Yeah.
That's right.
We're going to win. We're going to be victorious. We want to go undefeated. We want to do something. Well, that's you have the speculative. You have the rules. You have the game. You have the practice. You have to play the game. But ultimately, what inspires you to go out and wake up at 5 a.m. and hit the gym and run those and suffer through all those things? You're wanting to do something, and that's really the imaginative power.
Yeah, it's my imagination that's feeding. What would it look like to hold the trophy at the end of the year? It really is all of those things. So,
and I know this is a big trend right now, Father. This idea of kind of placing ourselves in the story of our reality, even amidst people like Jordan Peterson. Right, Carl Jung was a major psychologist who spoke about the narrative of our life and the archetypes by which we model our lives after, which kind of propel us into this what is not only a fairy tale, but in fact a part of our life. Or Jonathan Paggio, you have all these popular people who are tapping into this kind of psychological move that I think is very important. And I think a lot of people are desiring to even imagine what their life could look like off of social media sometimes. Like I wonder sometimes if this is just me kind of, thinking out loud here, but we were talking before we started the podcast, kind of the value of ordinary living. So many people are in such this imaginative capacity is so weak in most people that they've reduced their existence to what online tells them to live by. Right. And I know somebody like Tracy Rowland will say, because of mass media, we've lost our capacity to have culture, right? Why? Well, because culture requires that there's a locale sense of living. There's an imaginative role in which we place ourselves in this community of people, and this community of people cooks these dishes, for example, or wears these things and goes and sees these things together in their specific ways. Mass media gives us an imaginative vision by which we are to live by. And so now we have Kanye West telling us how to dress, what to say. Yeah. We have the Kardashian sisters telling us this or that thing.
Max listens to them all the time.
All the time. No, but my point being is you have this kind of this mass media portrayal of trying to, again, give us an imaginative vision for our lives rather than ourselves through prayer, through virtue, through discipline, through worship, through communion with others and with God, helping develop that imaginative intellect so as to be able to truly live according to principles, both speculatively and be able to gaze at first truths, but also practically in our own lives.
Yeah, powerful.
Yeah.
And I would, to go back to this, narrative is essential to this idea. Yeah. And that's where I would, to bring McIntyre into it. But what those people have done is they've given you the narrative. And one of the questions that every person asks is not just what do I do, but even a more fundamental question is of what communities do I belong to? And so what social media has done is says you belong to my community, to Kanye's or whoever all those people are, right? Sure. These are my communities. And so the point is that every one of us has this in our hearts. We're made for narrative. We're made for community, and we want to belong to a community. And the imagination is really where this occurs.
So we've just identified one potential negative effect of not having a well-formed imaginative intellect, right? We can be hijacked, and our story can be given to us by ideologues, by people who are motivated by, not by charity, let's say. What are, Father, some of the other negative effects that you see in our world today of people having underdeveloped imaginations, people not being in touch with their this faculty of their soul, of their intellect, really?
Well, it comes to the intellectual ability to really discern who I am, and as a result of that, it's come down to two things that I've seen grow, and it's a continuum, but it's began in fear, and it's led to an anxiety. And this is my own experience, my own pastoral experience when I got to KU.
Yeah, at college, right?
So like I told you, I went to KU, and I became the chaplain maybe 15 years after I left. So 16 years, 15 years. But I just remember before I went to KU as the chaplain, I was so excited because I thought, oh my gosh, they're going to have the same sense of excitement and future hope, the future full of hope kind of ideas, and I'm going to change the world and everything else. But what surprised me was the overarching emotion. It wasn't anger. It wasn't like the late 60s kind of, let's storm the...
Stick it to the man.
Stick it to the man. Yeah. It wasn't, let's take on the world, let's become wealthy like we did in the 80s, let's Reagan and all that kind of stuff. It was fear. And I was immediately struck within the first week. And I said, what is going on? And it wasn't just me. It was the sisters I was working with and some other campus ministers. And we kind of boiled it. We talked through this. We started talking to the students, and it came down to one thing. It was the fear of making a mistake. And it wasn't just, which is good. I mean, you don't want to make a mistake, but it was a paralyzing fear. Yeah. And it was a paralyzing fear that would involve very important things like choosing a major, or
who's my wife, who's my husband,
choosing a spouse. Yeah. And so what you ended up doing, you see this in the dating game, you either had hookups,
right,
or you had
perpetual discerners.
Yeah. Or as the young couple that came to me one time to my office, they were so proud, and they said, Father, we want to let you know we're going to start a 54-day novena to discern whether we should start dating.
Oh. Did you slap the guy in the face?
No, well, kind of. Metaphorically. No, my gosh.
In your imaginative intellect.
No, so first
you
of all,
slapped him in the face.
I was first kind of embarrassed because I had no idea there was a 54-day novena. Here I am as a priest.
I thought novena was 9. What is this 54? Yeah.
No, it was funny. They told me this, and when I said to them, I just went like this. I went, stop it. And they kind of threw up. I said, can I ask you guys some questions? And they're like, okay. And I said to the guy, I looked at him, I said, do you like her? And he said, yeah. And I said to her, do you like him? And she's kind of sheepishly said, yeah. And then I said, do you both like ice cream? And they're like, yeah. I said, well, take her out for ice cream. That's as much discernment you need to go on a date.
Right.
Oh, right. My gosh.
But they were so afraid. And because what did it mean for them? Well, a date meant that not that you get married tomorrow, but this was the person you're going to marry. And what if this isn't the person I'm going to marry?
Potential failure paralyzed them. So
paralyzed them.
To not to act.
Or a major. Some of the students I was finding they had chosen their major in 7th grade. And they had not veered from that path. And then they're freshmen. And they're in pre-med, and they're studying biology. And they come, and they're just like, my life is ruined. I don't want to be a doctor anymore. There's no hope for me. Well, of course there's hope. You change your major. But there was something in there that led to this fear. And it comes down to this way we discern knowledge. And I sent you a few quotes.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
And maybe if I could read them.
Please do.
So really, they're kind of the same things. One is from John Henry Newman, and then the other one is from Lumen Fide, which is an encyclical written by Pope Francis, but really originally written by Pope Benedict. Okay. And it was the first encyclical of Pope Francis. But so first of all, maybe I'll read Lumen Fide. It's a bit of a long quote. Is that okay?
That's totally fine.
So here's what Pope Francis, it's really Pope Benedict. He said, In contemporary culture, we often tend to consider the only real truth to be that of technology. Truth is what we succeed in building and measuring by our scientific know-how. Truth is what works and what makes life easier and more comfortable. Nowadays, this appears as the only truth that is certain, the only truth that can be shared, the only truth that can serve as a basis for discussion or for common undertakings. Yet at the other end of the scale, we are willing to allow for subjective truths of the individual, which consist in fidelity to his or her deepest convictions. Yet these are truths valid only for that individual and not capable of being proposed to others in an effort to serve the common good. So the point is this: we are only teaching young people two ways to come to the truth. What is scientific, what is measurable, which is modern reason, the empirical understanding of reason, or what my convictions are, which more or less comes down to my feelings. And so neither one of these are helpful for decisions like, what is my major? Right. What is my career? Right. Who am I going to marry? There's no computer program that you can type in the equation and then it will spit out the answer, oh, you are called to marry her. Right. It doesn't work. But we also know, and every young person experiences this, our emotions are fickle. Our passion, especially when we're young, we don't have this desire. I mean, our desires come and go. I wanted to be a doctor this semester. Right. Next semester, I want to be a lawyer. Yeah. Well, so now guess what? What's the result? There's no scientific equation, and my feelings come and go. How can I choose my spouse? How can I choose a major? How can I choose a career? Well, of course you're going to be fearful. And now even worse, with anxiety. But then this is where, it was about the same time I started to reread Newman. I took a class on Newman in seminary, but I had not really gone to him. And I came across this quote. And so this is the second quote I sent to you. He's talking about how we come to a decision. Yeah. And he says this, he says, an iron bar represents mathematical or strict demonstration. A cable represents moral demonstration, which is an assemblage of probabilities separately insufficient for certainty, but when put together, irrefutable. So here, if I could use this. So the image I use, what I can talk about is, let's say we're trying to build a bridge to the truth. The truth of the Eucharist, the truth of my spouse who I'm marrying, the truth of my vocation. So how do you build a bridge? Well, you need material. So according to Newman's idea is or even, let me stick with Benedict too, there's the truth of science, of math. And that's the iron bar, right? So what does science do? Let's use Occam's razor. Let's get down to the simple, what is the cause? What is the effect? And you can build a bridge with an iron bar, but it's not flexible, right? But it's not flexible. To use the opposite example, which is not Newman or Benedict, another way you can build a bridge is with wet spaghetti noodles. And that's trying to build a bridge to truth with my emotions. Your emotions. My passions, feelings, right? Now, you can build a bridge with it, but it can't bear a lot of weight. But Newman points out there's the middle way. And he says it's like a cable. And what's a cable? It's just a number of strands put together.
Twisted in such a way.
Twisted. There's flexibility, but pretty strong. You build a really good bridge with cables. And so a cable bridge. And this is where this is how we don't teach young people how to think like this to come to a conclusion. Yep. But if you look, so we can take either dating, Eucharist. Let me give an example, maybe for the Eucharist, what I mean. So we can study the Eucharist, but you can't study the Eucharist scientifically. True. You put the host under a microscope, it will look like bread. You can't do that. So that's not going to be helpful.
So the iron bar won't work.
Iron bar's not going to work. Nor can you say, well, why do you believe Jesus is truly present in the Eucharist? Well, because I feel it. Well, sometimes you do, but sometimes you don't.
I've been in prayer where sometimes I don't feel it.
You don't feel it. Does that mean Jesus isn't truly present? Well, of course not. So I'll give you this example. Let's say there's a guy. He was baptized second grade. He received First Holy Communion, made his first confession. Turned out to be his last confession for many years, last time he went to Mass. And he stopped going to Mass. His parents don't practice. Didn't really get any education after that. Then about 10 years later, he's visiting his grandparents who are still practicing the faith.
I think I've met this guy, by the way.
I think there's a lot of them. Well, I think I might be one of them. Well, he's in his grandparents' house, and his grandparents have this magazine on their table, and it's a Catholic magazine, and it tells a story about this Eucharistic miracle. Mm-hmm. All right, where a host bleeds and turns to flesh. He's like, man, this is whack. This is crazy. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But that gets him thinking. So he goes to his friend. He says, have you heard about this? And who's a practicing Catholic? He goes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is true because it's really the body and blood of Christ. Well, that inspires him. Okay, so that's the first strand in the cable. Mm. So he starts to study. And his friend said, well, read John 6. So he reads John 6. And then he says, oh, here's the catechism. So he reads the catechism. And he starts going to Mass. And then he starts going to adoration. And over time, and then he makes his second confession. And he's starting to be with people. And he's just sitting in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament. And he's practicing, he's studying, he's reading the great saints and the power of the Eucharist. So all of these, if you can consider them, these are little strands. None of them are sufficient. Over time, let's say 10 years later, this guy's going to Eucharistic adoration every week. He's going to Sunday Mass. Mm-hmm. He's active in his parish. He's talking about the Eucharist to his friends who don't believe.
He's all in.
He's all in. Mm. Why? It's not scientific. It's not emotions. It's that cable.
It's the
imaginative
of all
cable.
Of these things coming together, right?
Yes. And it's not a speculative, nor is it practical. That's where I talk about the imaginative. So here's what happens. Let's imagine. This guy's been a Catholic for 10 years.
Not John Lennon's.
No. Imagine there's a Eucharist.
Imagine there is a heaven.
There is a heaven.
Exactly.
We don't have to imagine.
That's right. It is. It's
well,
real.
we have to imagine it, but we don't. But we know there's a heaven.
Exactly. We because we can imagine, we know.
Yeah, but how do we know? Because there's a number of experiences we've had, and people have talked about it.
Yeah.
But here's what I want to point out.
Yeah.
Let's say 10 years later, this guy's coming across. He's reading in his Catholic Journal magazine, and it turns out that miracle of the Eucharist was fake, right? The priest did it to get people to come to Mass. It was all a fraud. Does that destroy his faith at this point?
No.
Not at all. Why?
Because all of it has come together, right?
Yeah.
Using his imaginative faculty.
That was the first strand.
Right.
But there's 1,000 other strands, right? Yeah. So, and you can think about this in terms of marriage and, so one reason I think people either hook up or are perpetual discerners is precisely for the same reason, right? Hooking up is, I think they watch too many of those romantic movies on Hallmark Channel,
or the Kardashian sisters, which is the trend, and this is in their hookup culture is what this is about.
But in a sense, they think that their emotions will discern. The romantic notion that I'm going to turn the corner, look into somebody's eyes, and that's my soulmate.
Yep, I'm in love.
And that's a hookup, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe and after a while, we'll fall in love. Then the others are like they never can make a decision because there's no mathematical formula, and their emotions come and go, and they've been betrayed by both. But if we can teach people to say, okay, now let's put this together, and over time, you can make a pretty solid moral determination. I'm called to be a priest. I'm called to marry this person. I'm called to do this major, whatever. And I think that would reduces our fear and anxiety. And that's why Newman talks about moral certainty.
Yeah. What's moral certainty? How is that different from?
As opposed to mathematical certainty.
Okay. Absolute kind of.
Okay.
Yeah. And what Newman was very clear, and Newman was a great defender of the rationality of the imaginative. And that's why Newman never went there, but I think he would have gotten there. But that faith is not contrary to reason. Faith is not irrational. But we have been brought up in a world, and we're talking about modernity and even into post-modernity, where this is the norm, right? That faith is irrational. But and that's another reason why I think bringing the imagination into the faculty of the intellect gives it cred that the imagination doesn't in our current understanding.
Yeah, and I want to that those three bridges, those three potential bridges. I love this image. You have the spaghetti string bridge of my emotions, which obviously isn't going to work if I just.
But it might be good depending on who cooked the spaghetti.
Yeah, it's really Italian stuff. It might
Yeah,
be,
al dente.
Al dente, of course.
So you have this spaghetti bridge, so that's going to be insufficient. Some people still might be thinking, though, wait, that iron bar of mathematical, speculative, technical certainty seems like it's the best option. It's going to get you across to the other side. But the quality that you just mentioned about the cable bridge is that it's flexible, right? Yeah. It can sway with the wind. It can account for all of the complexity of reality, so I'm thinking of the people who, come up with a plan for their life or have, a system or an ideology that they think like, this is going to govern me. This is what makes me feel secure. This is going to get me where I want to go. But then they go out into the world, and then there's all these differentiating factors that they didn't account for, and they either have to cling to their plan and kind of become crazy, or they fall off in despair, right? So I think that flexibility of this cable bridge, of this imaginative faculty, really makes it the most fitting to deal with all of the variant circumstances that we can encounter.
And drawing on that, I also think the imaginative intellect is disarming. I think it's a tool. I think it's a part of our, based on the proposition that you're given, Father. I think it's a tool that opens us up to receive those truths which we would have initially, those principles which we may have initially rejected. Too, right? Entering into this imaginative place prepares us to receive the principles, but also disposes us to feel the passions properly again. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
Like you're living, as you're walking the cable bridge, your fears now become maybe a little more tranquil, right? And as you're moving maybe closer to the end of the other side, you begin to feel excitement again, and you've walked this, and you've met the end. You're still living. It's still true, because that's what I'm thinking about now. And maybe I'm thinking of more of an apologetic twist. But if I'm talking to somebody and I'm basing it strictly off emotions, if a person's really looking for truth, they're going to know that's a weak argument. But also, if I'm just hammering my cousin or my friend with the hard principles of philosophy and theology.
Syllogisms.
Exactly, syllogisms. First of all, I'm going to be made fun of and get hit on my glasses because I'm a nerd. But also, what's going to happen is that they're not going to accept it.
It's not a human.
It's not a human thing.
Right?
But the imaginative is, and I think that's part of the reason why our Lord uses parables.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right, because they're disarming tactics to get us as humans to understand what it means to live as humans.
Yeah. It's the narrative aspects, the story. And I think there's a great recovery of narrative more recently across the board, but in Catholic circles especially. We're really focused on narrative, and we've neglected it, right? Mm-hmm.
Which, ironically, I've heard Jordan Peterson say this, our deepening appreciation of the role of narrative in human life is ironically a result of the postmoderns who saw its role but wanted to deconstruct all of it as power struggles. But what's cool about Jordan Peterson is he's like, no, actually the postmoderns, they were right about narrative being really important. It's kind of the foundation of how we operate. They were wrong about everything being a power struggle and all narratives being constructed to oppress somebody in a hidden way, but they were right about it being significant for human life.
Yeah.
Which I find fascinating.
I would agree. I consider myself a postmodernist. Absolutely.
Okay.
Very much in the same way. Yeah, a lot of these guys were really, they didn't get things right in that regard, but they really have helped us move forward.
So I'm in an elective class right now on the collected works of St. John of the Cross. And one of his big things.
You mean San Juan de la Cruz?
San Juan de la Cruz, yeah, that guy. Cruz.
De la Cruz.
One of his big things, obviously, is that one of the most potent way that we kind of come into contact with God in this life is through the act of faith, and that act of faith is in darkness, right? It's we don't see or perceive anything. Faith is what is unseen, right? And so St. John of the Cross, his whole thing is like, it's when you're not feeling anything, it's when you're complete desolation and you still cling to Jesus, that's actually the most powerful act of faith. That's when you're closest to him. So, and there's something very definitely true to that. And I'm thinking of, let's say you form a child and you start to form a child in the faith and they have this imaginative understanding of their faith and of the world. That's a very good thing. And I agree with you, Father, that's a necessary thing. But like eventually the story that they're telling themselves, because every thought that we have about God is not God, right? Every image that we conceive of God and of our faith in our minds might be a small reflection of the reality, but is ultimately very inadequate to the reality itself. And so there's this process of the imaginative vision that we construct gradually throughout our lives. We have to continue to let go of them and transcend them in order to get to a higher plane. So a child, for example, who thinks of God as a big guy with white hair in the sky, that's actually perfectly appropriate for a child to think in that way, right? It's an appropriate vision, imaginative vision for a child to have about God. But as the child grows, what's going to have to happen is that vision is going to have to die. There's going to have to be a death in their pursuit of going deeper into the truth. And so I'm wondering and just thinking that, and eventually they'll come to a more sophisticated understanding of God. But even that understanding of God, like all of our understandings of God, is going to be inadequate. Yeah. And eventually, the deeper and up and in that we go, the more we're going to have to let go of these visions that we've had, and that can be disorienting. And that's when John of the Cross is like, that's when you're exercising true faith, right? Yeah. But my thought would be, I don't know if you've thought about this, Father, but as we're forming people or attempting to form people in the imagination, bringing that consideration into it. Like, yeah, it's good that you're constructing a narrative of your life and of your relationship to God as you're living it, as you're experiencing it. But we have to be aware of, as good as our imaginations are, and they do communicate truth to us, but that truth there's always a further up and further in that we could reach, and we have to be ready to kind of surrender the story we're telling ourselves. Absolutely. For the higher story.
And Newman would completely agree.
Okay.
In Grammar of Assent, he says it almost verbatim. He says, "You cannot imagine God."
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. My gosh. And if you're imagining God, it's an idol.
Right. Exactly.
It's not. You can't imagine God. God is ineffable. Right. And as Augustine, if you think you understand God, you don't understand God.
Ratzinger would say that in order, the Christian is the one who dies, whose ego dies in walking towards a cross, right? So again, this is like my ideas have to die, right? What in Galatians we hear, my desires and passions and ideas have to die, has to be crucified to the cross.
Yeah, and I would say it's not just in faith, but really in everything. So you began this. We're talking about imagination. I think it's important for us. I talk, for you guys and for married engaged couples to distinguish between imagination and fantasy.
Okay, yeah.
Right. So now you guys are imagining life as a priest, and the odds are it's going to be better than you imagine. But to be honest, there's a lot of fantasy mixed into it. There just is, and there's no way around it. And it's not a bad thing. I would fear for the guy who's a deacon and not imagining the priesthood that didn't have some fantasy in it.
Okay. So you're telling me every time I give a homily, the congregation's not going to just weep and convert on the spot?
Well, for Deacon Max, yes, but not for you, Joey.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
You're right.
Dang.
Yeah. Maybe when he gets up to preach, they start weeping. Like, oh.
They're weeping for different reasons, not because it's good, but because it's me.
But what I say is, don't give up on the imagination or what you imagine.
Okay, yeah.
But allow yourself to let the fantasy burn away. Or for a married couple, right? And so a religious sister told me this one time. She said she works with both guys who are discerning priesthood and marriage, and there's this cross where I think when you're a seminarian, we just hammer it into you. Priesthood's hard, priesthood's tough. You got to suffer. You're giving up so much, right? And you just you got to give your whole life, and then you get ordained, and they're like, and you might think, why didn't they tell me how great it is, right? So you kind of, there's a cross. Oh my gosh, there's plenty of crosses in the priesthood, but more or less your formation is preparing you to suffer a lot. Where with a married couple, you can tell them that, but they don't really believe that. They're like, oh yeah, but we love each other. We love each other. But what will happen is when those couples will come back to us after they're married, they'll often say something like, we didn't know marriage was so hard, so difficult. Now, but there's also, of course, many blessings.
Yeah.
But ultimately, in each case, there's going to be fantasy. And I think sometimes people are discouraged by that, and they think, oh, maybe I should get divorced. Maybe I made a mistake. Well, no, you had a fantasy.
Right.
They're not going to all weep when you get up and preach. They're not, whatever it might be. Your pastor's not going to be your best friend. Your spouse is going to betray you. Not in big things, but in day-to-day life. Okay, that was a fantasy that you would never have a disagreement. You know what I mean? So yeah,
right.
but with God, God is the big tall guy with white hair and a bushy beard. That's got to burn away.
Yeah.
Because that's not God.
Right.
But it's a fitting image.
Right. And in the marriage analogy, when the fantasy is revealed as precisely that, a fantasy, and it starts to burn away, do I give up and quit, or do I realize that the burning away of this fantasy can be integrated into a new imaginative understanding of what I am and my story and what I'm doing and how I'm living in it, right?
Yeah, I've oftentimes, this is getting very specific, but I want to draw on this example, Father. I oftentimes reflect, especially now as I'm getting closer to priestly ordination, about kind of my own upbringing in the faith. And one of the things that was essential in my faith growing up was I was an altar boy. Just part of what I did. Did I always want to be there? No. Would Father give me $10 when I would show up sometimes? Absolutely. And for that reason alone, I would often show up, right? But I often will think about like how great it would have been for Father, even in those times, to have incentivized altar serving. One of the things like money, but I know like a lot of give me some money to be there as a little kid. $5-10 goes a long way. Now nothing, but then
for me it does. what kind of line of work are you in?
Well, podcasts we're rolling.
Oh, that's it. Yeah.
This thank you for Logos Podcast.
This rector,
give us our
Patreon isn't working out.
Patreon, YouTube, subscribe, please, guys. Thank you for that. So, but you see these kind of, and especially I would say maybe more traditional Catholic communities incentivize their young men to serve at the altar, to wear specific regalia, to have on a crucifix or whatever, and as you work your way up, you get a particular surplus, you get, the vestment that goes over the cassock, whatever, these little things that seem so minuscule and some people would even make fun of. The idea, it seems to me, at least one of the positives, is that it helps develop this imaginative vision. Okay, guy, if you become a priest, yes, some of these things are going to have to go. Your nice little blue ribbon is no longer going to exist in that specific way, right? But it's helpful to foster what could be in a similar way with a kid on a basketball team or a football team. Give him the Jordans, give him the nice stuff, give him one day he's not going to have those, right? One day his knees are going to hurt, okay? But right now
they do.
But I'm sorry about that. And your hip,
his
and
and his hip,
everything. I'm sorry, man. But my point being is that those things are not unimportant to the development of the altar boy, of the basketball player, of the father, the mother, right? They help develop, and they help, this imaginative vision is a point towards the future, a look towards the past, but it informs how we're living life right now. Yeah. Because it's real.
Oh, sure.
Right. Again, going back to that point, which I made earlier, but I think it's so fascinating because it's something that I myself, as I get closer to priestly ordination, I see how true what you're saying is in my own life. Yeah.
Yeah, and I also think that a big part of the desire amongst the younger generation, our generation, those even younger than us, for more traditional liturgy is because there's an absence of, like, it feeds their imagination, right? You see a beautiful liturgy and it's something is being communicated to me about the world that's real and that is
non-scientific specific.
Right.
Yeah.
Or just emotions.
Well, this is the postmodern modern difference. And essentially, like in theology, Father Gus de Noia wrote this article. Now he's Archbishop de Noia. He wrote this probably late 90s, but he distinguished between the two questions modern theology asks and postmodern. And modern theology said their goal of theology and catechesis was to ask this question: what is a compelling, persuasive, rational explanation of the truth?
Yep.
Right? Yep. But remember, in modernity, rationality is very limited, primarily the scientific, mathematical.
Yep.
And so what you ended up having, is, not only in theology but also in liturgy, is we must make this, in order to be believable, it must be understandable in a limited, rational sense. So this is what you ended up, this is why you wanted to throw out the altar paintings and the altar.
We don't need those candlesticks. Get them out of here.
No, because we need to get down to what is understood. So if you guys barely remember the old translation of the Roman Missal, right?
And also with you.
Yeah. But basically, if you go back, well, we still have the collects and the breviary. Right. I mean, some of them are so pathetic. God, you are good. Help us to be good through Christ our Lord. Amen. And then we get the new translate, that was already there.
Yeah.
And you read the collects now. Like as a priest, I can preach on these collects.
Right.
They're so powerful.
Right.
Because what Denoya said, that's what modern theology was trying to do. If we make it understandable, it becomes believable. Well, we found that that's absolutely false. In fact, the opposite is true. Where he says the postmodern theologian and catechist says, how can I open up the deep intelligibility of this doctrine, of the wisdom? That how can I open this up, this great mystery? And so that's why I think a lot of younger people are more open to tradition and beautiful vestments and, Gregorian chant. And
they're willing to wake up for a super early Rorate Celli mass where there's just candles scattered throughout the altar. People just, again, for our non-Catholic listeners, this is a specific celebration within Advent. But my point being here is that they're willing to go above and beyond to have the smoke and all this stuff. Yeah. Again, Yeah.
But I love the way you said that, Father. It's these elements are not quote unquote understandable in like a rationalistic way, but they are intelligible. It's not that they're completely devoid of rationality. There's something deeper that you're being drawn into precisely because you're not trying to present it in scientific, plain, here it is, this is what we believe, this is what we do terms.
Yeah. It's good.
Okay, I think that's probably enough. Even though we could keep going, dude. This is awesome.
I hope you've enjoyed the conversation, Father.
It's been wonderful to be with you guys. I'm very honored.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, very honored.
Yeah, and we have to say, I was going to say this at the beginning when Deacon Max said that we're grateful for everything you've done, but I figured it'd be more fitting at the end. Seriously, so I've been at this seminary for 8 years, and 5 of them?
Yeah, 6. It's my 6th year.
You've been here, and it's just, I am deeply, deeply grateful for you and for your leadership of the seminary. And the greatest gift of my life has been my formation here and my transformation here and getting ready for the priesthood. I'm so excited for it, and really, I'm so grateful. So thank you for everything.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. But it's not the rector that makes a place; it's the whole community.
For sure.
And I think you guys, for those listeners who have never been here, I think it's a holy place, it's a happy place, and it's a healthy place. And really, you guys are great.
Thank you.
And I say to all this, every man here is a good man, and I think that's even Max,
especially me.
Well, I'm going to take that back.
No, thank you, Father.
Yeah.
Thank you for everything. Since I've gotten here, you've been very welcoming. I got here when you got here. We sure did, and we're ending. Well, at least I'm leaving here soon. But all I have to say, we always had good, in-depth conversations that Joseph Pieper, and that's about the only guy I've ever read. And but I really do appreciate you, and thank you for coming on to this humble project. So to our listeners, Father Beseau, everybody, we hope you've learned something and you've drawn closer to the Logos, Jesus Christ, and what we've talked about. That's the point of what we do. So without further ado, as always, God bless.